Gentlemen, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves? We'll start with you, Rob.
Rob Brown. I work for DHS, Division Chief of Enterprise Infrastructure, and recently just took on this job, which has been enjoyable, formerly from the software development team. So I've been able to straddle both development as well as infrastructure and operations.
Terry Luedtke, Department of Veterans Affairs, Chief Architect for EHR, Electronic Health Record Modernization. That has started fairly recently. Before that, I was on Architect for Vista Evolution.
Excellent, excellent. And great programs and sort of vitally important to a lot of the things that Matt was talking about. So thanks for those contributions, and that's great. So Rob, let's start a little bit and let's talk about the journey that you guys have sort of found yourself on at CIS and sort of what you guys have been working through in the last 18 months? What kind of time frame are we talking about?
Sure, yeah, it's been about 18 months or so. Really coming in as a contractor to USCIS with sort of a mission of helping to establish and promote DevOps, really from a technical perspective, to some degree a cultural perspective, which sort of follows suit in this case. We, upon arrival, sort of came to understand that we had a very disparate sort of ecosystem of multiple CI and CD tool sets throughout the organization. So really, from a technical and cultural perspective, everybody was sort of doing their own thing. Pipelines all over the place, again, different tool sets, different frameworks for automated testing, different frameworks for delivery into AWS or into a data center. Upon sort of getting a good understanding of that landscape and sort of approaching this challenge of disparate actions and tools and essentially next to zero transparency and nominal collaboration, really trying to move forward with what sort of tools and what sort of technology can we start to introduce to start to come across a common ground for folks to start to sort of embrace things like inner sourcing, things like just, again, standardized pipelines that we could continuously have sort of the dry principle. So we started moving forward with actually everyone aggregating on a common version control system. That ended up being not promoting anything, but that ended up being GitHub within the enterprise. So we actually started to have all of the teams starting to aggregate with one common focal point. And that sort of pivoted into moving with a common CI platform, and then ultimately from a CD or continuous delivery perspective, looking at a platform that helped enable sort of future state, being containers, and again, standardizing and having the right sort of level of governance for that pipeline and value stream, which ended up being OpenShift.
Nice. So, and I've heard of open source, and I've certainly heard of closed source. What's inner sourcing? You mentioned that, and you kind of flew right over that. Can you explain a little bit of what that was?
Sure. So we, as we move forward and we're aggregating all of these disparate teams to start to leverage one common version control system for configuration management, one of our thoughts in moving forward was, again, promoting the use of really code reuse and having a common sort of tool set where we could start to collaborate on issues across different portfolios, as well as just certain sections within a division, and then ultimately across all of the OIT grouping.
So collaboration and sharing of source code within the organization for multiple missions.
Correct.
That's amazing. That's great. Sounds like it was a little bit of a mess, so we're actually going to stop there because we want to hear how you got out of that. But let's talk a little bit about where you found yourself at the VA.
So at the VA, we have Vista as our electronic health record system. And I actually think of it as sort of an internal open source project starting back in the 80s and 90s, where it was developed by individuals across the country in different VA medical centers, VAMCs, working together and sharing code back and forth to develop these individual systems. That is now an open source health record system, CSRA. But over the 80s and 90s and 2000s, as you can imagine, we got to a point where it's a little fragile, a little difficult to work with.
A little technical debt?
A little technical debt, yes. And also, we currently have 130 instances of them. So anytime we try to innovate you will run into the differences on every single one that is causing, it just makes it difficult. So as part of this evolution, we're looking at how do we get that to a point where it's standard, so we have sort of a seamless experience across the VA. But then in last June, we decided to go even seamless with DoD. So now with EHR modernization, we're going to a single commercial EHR. But we still want to innovate. We still want to give opportunity for development and new additions to that, not just be locked into one vendor. And API is going to be a big strategy, part of that strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rob, you sort of came into this environment where it sounds like you had a lot of different CI/CD pipelines, you had a lot of different sort of dev shops all over the place. How did you really integrate all of those CI/CD instances and pipelines and efforts into sort of one coherent vision?
Well, we're still working on that, first of all.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't expect anyone could solve that in 18 months.
And part of it is just, again, a culture of that inner sourcing, culture of experimentation, really trying to promote that throughout the organization, and as well as, because this is a highly regulated, compliant-driven environment, ensuring that we have some level of governance. So again, trying to minimize a lot of the rogue actors, rogue systems. So the goal was, let's go through a complete value stream impact analysis. Let's look at what we can do to really build a dev factory. So again, some of the tooling I've already stated, as we stood up, the goal was, again, true multi-tenancy with the goal of empowering, essentially, our customers from the platform or site reliability engineer, customer reliability engineer's perspective, empowering our customers, which could be development teams, portfolio teams, even infrastructure teams, to leverage, essentially, this value stream from common source code repo to a CI platform that they could get constant feedback across multiple teams within a common area, as well as, again, from doing continuous delivery in a reusable format. So a lot of this really, again, stems from having a good sort of onboarding strategy from a platform perspective. And we had to do road shows and get some buy-in and work with different groups and teams to the point where we were actually having training of a lot of these platforms twice a month. Really, again, for enabling these sorts of practices and showing what it can and can't do.
Right. So we've talked a little bit about your transition. Where do you find yourselves today at the VA? Where have you guys moved forward to?
Well, with the HR modernization that's just started last June, big announcement. Well, we've been looking at FHIR, fast interoperable health resources from HL7, and that's been a definite basis on everything we've done with this evolution. And now, just this week, less than a mile from here, the AMIA, the American Medical Informatics Association, was having their symposium, and lots of interest in FHIR. How do we get that to be a profile for what we're building on? How do we get that for what they call smart apps? So taking a profile to encourage community development, and that's what we've been focusing on there. And that's going to continue with what we're doing. So that's a big part of that. The Health Share Platform Consortium is also a big piece of that, on how do we encourage development and then bring that both in-house and out of the VA.
And so technology is all fine and good.
Right.
But how is this impacting your lines of business within the VA? What's your, break it down from a business perspective?
That's a good question. So from a business perspective, definitely looking at how we can be seamless and consistent across all of our lines, and not just healthcare. There's a recent RFI for Lighthouse for API development across all of VA, including benefits, to make healthcare and benefits and make all of that much easier to navigate, and making that a consistent sort of development environment for all of our developers.
Gotcha. Rob, how about you? Line of business impact?
Again, I think as we move forward culturally, and in the position I'm in now from an infrastructure perspective, I'd like to see how, from a true DevOps perspective, even a DevSecOps perspective, how we can start to actually work and reorganize ourselves to be more in tune with, similar to a software development perspective, more in tune with those lines of business in an infrastructure manner as well. And the platforms that we derive and service, we actually have those engineers riding with not only the development teams, but also interfacing and interacting with product owners. and owning essentially that service delivery for those customers, helping them with ideation all the way to production, and helping to establish feedback right down to where that end user sits from a CIS perspective, actually hopefully being able to be with that adjudicator and understanding what that business really means and feeding it all the way back to product owners that may need more of that feedback.
It sounds like you've been on a path of really building a little bit of developer nirvana, right? You want to get the best out of those developers. And you did mention governance and you did mention security. Tell me a little bit more about how security is figuring into this so you don't have quite the wild, wild west that maybe it sounds like you started with.
So yeah, and really I think a lot of this started, from my perspective anyways, it's just my opinion and how my story from CIS, as we moved forward with a lot of these platforms, we actually made, well, we didn't make, we partnered with security engineers at the onset. So when we had these ideas, when we went through looking at the right contracts, looking at the right tooling, they were riding shotgun and sometimes driving. So to that point, the ideation and moving forward, but also as we developed a lot of these platforms, they had to be with us. They were actually developing Ansible scripts with us, developing CloudFormation templates with us. They were actually part and parcel of that team. And we continue as we move forward with new sort of platforms, new tools, et cetera. We continue to sort of have that same playbook. Mm-hmm. And so far it's been successful. From a whole sort of value stream, workflow governance perspective, having those same sort of engineers start to integrate those tools from static code analysis to something like container scanning, as well as even sort of OWASP ZAP type scanning, having those folks be a part of that pipeline perspective, and that really has been a success for us thus far. I know later on another gentleman or colleague will be talking, I think, a little bit more in depth about ongoing ATO,
right,
and hopefully some of the tools, sort of that partnership that we've developed and continue to move forward with.
And if you want it to be an ongoing process, you have to have them there at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Right? You can't create an ongoing process that includes security at the end 2 days after you were supposed to go to production.
This is not bolt-on. We cannot live in a bolt-on world anymore. They have to be part of that team. Sometimes it manifests, and how it has manifested is in doing a war room style effort where we've sat in a room for a couple of weeks and this is our focus. And that has, again, proven to be pretty successful.
Excellent, excellent. What was your security experience?
Some similar aspects of that, certainly the static code scanning and those sorts of tools. I would love to see more tooling to be able to put that into continuous development, and how do you actually hook that in just to be automated. So far what we've been doing is really tying it in with our agile development cycles. So in the past, you'd get to the end, you'd go to try to get your authority to operate, and stacks and stacks of output from the scanning tools. Now we have it where it's a weekly scan, and it immediately goes into the backlog of your agile.
But if you just drop
by the time you get to the end, well, yeah. So by the time we get to the end, you get 2 or 3 instead of the stack, because it's been part of your development cycle the whole time.
I had always thought the strategy was to just drop as much paper on the CISO as possible, as close to production date, and then they would sign whatever you said.
No.
The
goal is to be secure.
That's
privacy.
Good to know. Yeah.
It's a big deal.
Gotcha. As we sort of build these forward-looking, right? Because there is no end state, as Matt said. It's a continual relay race of modernization. How are things like API-driven development sort of figuring into your next generation of sort of architecture, infrastructure, and also dev practices?
Well, I think part of the developer nirvana is trying to take those complex yet high-value sort of functions and putting them in APIs so the next developer that come along doesn't have to reinvent it and learn all the gotchas there, because now they have an API to work with, and that's really kind of our focus. We've had success with that with patient identity. So we have a service now that helps you deal with identifying a patient and matching patients, which sounds simple, but becomes really complicated really quickly. The whole how many birthdays here, how many people here have the same birthday,
right,
kind of problem. So I think that's really trying to make their lives easier while ensuring that we have better quality.
I think first is setting the stage that the digital asset of tomorrow or even today really is API and not a UI.
Right.
So having that sort of lingua franca in place is important. And then moving forward from a developer nirvana perspective is ensuring that those developers have the right tools in place, again, with a level of governance, so that they essentially could have a portal that they could all work in, that there is a marketplace to promote that sort of DRI principle, right? So thinking it from that perspective, also the ability to consume, which does happen, a lot of rogue APIs that may be presented as different Swagger pages across an organization. Being able to consume that into some general place to capture those APIs into, again, the general group of developers as a whole in an organization, or even just at a portfolio level, so we're not wasting time.
And it's interesting because if you think about this, you're sort of moving forward in this infrastructure continuum that we're building on behalf of developers, right? So first it's building that consistent platform, then it's building that consistent layer of APIs so that they can worry about writing applications that are much more focused on the mission and on the business, which I think is really great.
Talked a little bit about sort of, I don't want to say documentation, but the portal and making it easier for them to find. Because certainly within the VA, we have, I think, 8,000 IT employees, 325,000 people in just the healthcare side of it. So trying to get the word across to everybody that this exists, because otherwise people develop something just thinking that it's not already out there. How do you make it clear that here's where you go to find it, here's how you find it, and how you use it?
Absolutely. And then, I don't know if you're thinking about this yet, but how do you monitor APIs? How do you metric APIs? How do you do chargeback or even showback of who's using an API? All of that is going to become part of that problem set that you're going to sort of find yourselves in. So what about, how has this process really driven the culture of innovation within the organization?
Again, I think it does start back with having what sort of culture do we want to have? And I think from the perspective really of a developer, I want to have as much freedom as I can. Mm-hmm. So providing the developer, empowering the developer to have that freedom, I think is really important. It's sort of that trust but verify piece to bring in the security as well as sort of an ITPM perspective to ensure that there is some sort of level of moderning what's going on. As well as, again, from that inner sourcing, right? If we start to really take an inner sourcing perspective and opening all of the code up for everyone in the organization to see, ideally everyone at DHS to see, leverage and take advantage of, that's really the ultimate goal. So the transparency, as well as that it is open, also gives us a secondary benefit of hopefully code quality, because everybody can look at it. I think is also a big thing. So again, I think it's sort of transparency, inner sourcing to help drive a lot of that culture. And some of that's just manifested in quick, easy access to people that can help you in the form of something like a Slack channel, right? Mm-hmm. So as opposed to doing a change request or going through the whole ticketing process just to get somebody to turn a knob, if I can actually activate that individual or have a conversation with that individual that's responsible for that other downstream piece or even upstream piece, then my world I've just saved maybe a week of time. Right. So, I mean, that constant communication, the ability to hit a belly button and a couple lines of text can make a world of difference. And so, over time, it's kind of come in as to be the world of developers. We want to get back out to where people in the field feel like they can innovate and have good ideas. We do have at the VA an innovation center, so sort of maintaining a sandbox where people can go in and develop and share these APIs so that they have a place to go and even just experiment safely and with safe de-identified data, that kind of thing. So data has definitely been a big issue of how do you set up something that someone can start working with, and maybe have a hackathon against right away, and really focusing on how do we get that out there.
So imagine, if you will, that you had a room full of people that were incredibly interested in this problem and were probably somewhere on this journey. Mm-hmm. What's sort of the one or two tips that you would give them as they embark?
Well, one of my tips is actually looking backwards a little bit, is making sure you have a strategy or a plan for decommissioning, because it's really easy to go in and look and go like, well, here's the old system, here's all the problems with it, we're going to fix all those problems, but no one talks about the 3 or 4 things that are absolutely critical in that system that just work. No one talks about it because they always work, but if you go to try to turn it off and you haven't migrated those capabilities over, you wind up running 2 systems, and that's not good for anybody. So really keeping an eye on looking backwards and shedding things off as well as bringing on the new features.
I'll be quick. So we were fortunate enough to have a visionary leader, Mark Schwartz, and he actually created management instructions that really helped promote the vision. It promoted the ability for the dev teams, the infrastructure teams, the operations teams to actually move forward in this sort of a manner. So that to me was step number one, as well as that support, the constant ability to not only have this in place, but also the support to be innovative, to experiment, to fail. I mean, we've already heard, I'm sure we've all heard this before, but if it's championed at the highest level, then that really made it the easiest for us to move forward with this.
I could not agree more. I've been in scenarios where we had folks who were no smarter than anyone else, but who had that charter, and that charter from management, that organizational authority to affect change, is tremendous. So I think that's huge. Well, great. Thank you very much, and that's all for us.